Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Missouri Foothills. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1842, and in the rolling foothills east of Springfield, a woman was sold who would become the center of a legend that even the church refused to speak of. Her name was Dinah Clay, and though her origins were recorded as unknown, the bill of sale noted one detail that witnesses later swore could not have been written by an honest hand. Eyes, one pale, one dark. She was bought by Mr. Elias Broder, a widowed planter known for his careful manners and colder heart. His property sat on a low ridge overlooking the Gasconade tributary, an isolated stretch of land where fog clung to the trees even in summer. Locals said no songbirds nested there. The people of Phelps County were already steeped in unease that year. Missouri was a slave state surrounded by restless talk of abolition, and the tension between fear and guilt hung heavier than the rain. Newspapers spoke of new legal challenges in St. Louis, cases like the one that would later be known as Dred Scott v. Sanford, where questions of freedom and personhood were being argued in hushed courtrooms. But here, in the foothills, such questions weren't spoken aloud. They lingered in the way people looked away from one another at church. When Dinah arrived, the household changed. The dogs refused to approach her. The Broder children, 2 boys, 1 girl, stopped speaking at table. Neighbors reported seeing strange lights at the window of her quarters, and some claimed to hear humming that wasn't in any language they knew. Elias Broder himself began to decline. Once upright and loud, he became gaunt. His hair turned silver in weeks. His clerk, Mr. Lyle, wrote in a surviving ledger, "The master eats little. The woman sings to herself at night. The air feels different when she is near, like before thunder." One night that autumn, a visitor riding past the Broder property swore he saw the house lit from within by a cold blue light, and Dinah standing in the yard, staring toward the river. Her eyes, he said, looked like day and night sharing the same face. By morning, Mr. Broder was found dead in his chair, untouched and unmarked, as if his heart had simply refused another hour. The coroner recorded it as apoplexy. But the neighbors, uneasy and whispering, began to call her something else, the Bondwoman of 2 eyes. After the death of Elias Broder, the household fell under an uneasy silence. The property passed to his brother Nathaniel, a man known for thrift and superstition in equal measure. Within days of his arrival, he ordered Dinah locked in the outer quarters until the estate's legal affairs were settled. "She'll be gone before winter," he told his foreman. Yet, as records and letters from that year suggest, she was not so easily dismissed. Neighbors said the new master began hearing noises around the house, footsteps on floors that no one crossed, the faint hum of song drifting from the yard long after the wind had died. The dog still wouldn't go near her door. One broke its chain trying to flee the property, another simply vanished. By the end of the month, Nathaniel's wife refused to stay in the main house. "The air changes when that woman looks at you," she wrote to her sister. "You feel the inside of yourself go cold." The county physician, Dr. Horace Leeming, described visiting the plantation in December 1842 to certify the cause of Elias' death. In a private letter, later found among his papers, he mentioned the bondwoman with eyes unlike any I have seen, one gray as winter sky, one dark as pitch. He added, almost in apology, "I could not meet her gaze for long." Throughout the foothills, whispers spread that Dinah was descended from a line of seer women, once enslaved in Virginia and rumored to have survived fires that consumed entire estates. Some said she carried the mark of divided sight, the ability to see both the world of the living and the other place that ran beneath it. No one dared repeat this in court, but the story lingered like smoke in the valley air. In January, the Broder family's only daughter fell ill. The girl cried out at night, insisting she saw a woman standing at the foot of her bed, humming. When asked to describe her, she whispered, "Her eyes don't match, and she's smiling like she knows my name." Nathaniel blamed Dinah immediately. He ordered her flogged before the servants, but witnesses said the whip split in the overseer's hand before striking. The record of punishment in the plantation ledger ends abruptly that day. Instead, the next entry, penned in a shaking script, reads, "Storm came from nowhere. House struck twice. Lights in her window all night." 3 days later, the child recovered completely, though the family physician could find no cause. Dinah, however, was gone. Her quarters were empty save for a folded piece of muslin containing a lock of gray hair, Elia's Broder's. No one saw her leave, and no horse or wagon had passed the gates. When spring came, the Broder fields turned to dust. Crops refused to take, and the well water ran bitter. The neighbors said the ridge had claimed its price. And at night, travelers swore they could still see a woman walking by the river, head covered, eyes catching moonlight like two opposing stars. By midsummer 1843, the Broder estate stood abandoned. Nathaniel had left the county for St. Louis, where he died within a year. The servants scattered, taking with them only fragments of the story, each version darker than the last. One claimed that Dinah Clay had drowned herself in the river, though no body was ever found. Another said she had walked straight into the water and kept walking, the current parting around her until the mist swallowed her whole. The county clerk, Samuel Thorne, wrote that the estate's ledgers had been retrieved weeks later from the empty house. The ink on every page had faded to the same gray hue, except for one entry scrawled in fresh hand. "I have seen both sides of the river." After the Broder's departure, the land changed. The willow trees along the waterline grew twisted, their roots rising from the soil like ribs. Children refused to go near the banks. "The air there listens," one boy told his mother, "like it's waiting for her to talk again." That same year, the local physician, Dr. Leeming, the same who once treated the family, fell ill. Before his death, he asked his assistant to burn his papers, claiming they contained things seen that men were not meant to write. The young man disobeyed and found a single surviving note sealed in wax. "Her pulse did not change when I touched her wrist. It was as though it beat elsewhere." Rumors of Dinah's sight began spreading through neighboring counties. Travelers spoke of a tall woman with a shawl over her face, one eye gleaming pale in the dark, seen at crossroads or river bends before sudden storms. In Gasconade County, a ferry overturned one night, drowning 6 passengers. Survivors claimed they had refused a woman passage moments before the lightning struck. By 1845, the Missouri legislature was tightening laws over the movement of the enslaved. The papers were full of names, runaways, fugitives, and the newly freed who had vanished into the frontier. Among them appeared an entry that no clerk claimed to have written. Dinah Clay, female, mixed ancestry, identifying marks heterochromia, status untraceable. Even decades later, when historians revisited the case while studying the tensions that led to the Dred Scott decision, they treated her story not as myth but as warning, a glimpse of how fear and guilt could twist a region's conscience. Yet for those who lived near the foothills, she never vanished at all. They said that when fog rolled in without wind, 2 lights glowed on the riverbank, one white, one black, like eyes still watching from beyond the water's skin. The year 1846 brought a hard drought to the Missouri foothills. Streams ran dry, and the air turned metallic with dust. Old settlers said the land was still under the spell of the Broder woman, the one with eyes that could see the world divided in two. Whatever curse or blessing she left behind had seeped into the soil itself. It was during that same summer that a new family, the Hardens, purchased what remained of the Broder property. They found the house half collapsed and the outbuildings rotted through, but the land was fertile and cheap. They planted corn, built a new barn, and set to work. Within a week, the eldest son reported hearing a woman's voice at dusk, singing in the distance. "Not loud," he told a neighbor. "Just the kind of song that makes the air forget itself." At first they dismissed it as the sound of the river. Then the livestock began refusing water from the lower well. Mrs. Harden herself saw what she called a glimmer in the corn rows, a shimmer of blue light moving slowly against the wind. She thought it fireflies until she saw it rise into the shape of a woman's figure. That same night, the crops on the north side of the field burned in a perfect circle, though no one smelled smoke. The next morning, when the ash cooled, the ground showed two footprints pressed deep as if made by bare feet. One print was small, the other slightly larger, as if someone had stood beside herself. Word spread through the county that Dinah Clay had returned. The Hardens tried to hire a preacher to bless the land, but none would come. "That ridge is older than Scripture," one said. Records from Reverend Abel Vance's circuit journal mention visiting the site that autumn. He wrote, "There is nothing there, and yet everything. The grass bends where no wind blows. I felt as though my shadow did not belong to me." He also noted that one of the Hardin daughters had eyes of two colors, one gray, one brown, and that the family left Missouri within the year. Later generations would recall that the girl grew into a quiet woman who avoided mirrors, and that her own daughter would be born with the same mismatched gaze. When neighbors began whispering about the divided bloodline, the Hardins' name vanished from census rolls. Fires consumed the few records that mentioned them, just as they had the Broders before. By 1848, travelers spoke of seeing two lights on the riverbank instead of one pale, one dark, moving in perfect rhythm, like the mirrored eyes of a single face watching the living pass by. Those who saw it swore the water below glowed faintly, as if remembering something it wished it could forget. By 1849, the story of Dinah Clay, the bondwoman with mismatched eyes, had grown into something the Missouri Foothills could neither bury nor explain. The Broder estate remained abandoned, yet travelers swore the land still carried her presence, something heavy, half-remembered, and unwilling to fade. That winter, a circuit clerk from Jefferson County, Mr. Thomas Merle, was assigned to inventory the remaining property titles of the valley. In the half-collapsed Broder house, he found a leather-bound book wedged behind the hearthstone. The first half was written in Elias Broder's hand, listing household goods, debts, and the names of those enslaved under his estate. The second half, written in a far steadier script, contained something else entirely, pages filled only with names, places, and dates that stretched back decades beyond Broder's lifetime. Some of the names were familiar: merchants, overseers, even clergymen. Others were unknown, but all had one thing in common: each was marked with a small black dot beside it. Merle turned the book over to the county office, but before the ink could be cataloged, it faded overnight. All that remained were faint impressions where the quill had pressed too hard, as though the paper itself had tried to forget. Merle left the county soon after. In a letter to his cousin, he wrote, "The handwriting in those later pages was not his. It looked feminine, deliberate, unhurried." The letters slanted differently, as if one eye saw the page from the right and the other from somewhere else. Around the same time, residents of nearby Hickory Hollow began reporting the return of strange lights near the old Broder Ridge. Not flickers or torches, but twin orbs of pale fire that hovered just above the ground, moving together slowly. One white, one darker, faintly red at its edge. They always appeared before storms, and when thunder rolled across the foothills, the lights would vanish. Folklore claimed Dinah was still keeping her ledger somewhere under the soil, writing the names of those who had wronged the living and the dead alike. The preachers warned against repeating the tale. "Every name spoken," Reverend Vance said from his pulpit, "is an invitation." Yet even he refused to sleep near windows on storm nights. By the following year, the river that bordered the property had shifted course, cutting a new channel straight through what had once been the Broder family cemetery. Every headstone toppled but one, the unmarked slab under the willow. Beneath it, the earth remained untouched, hard as stone. Farmers who plowed too close said their horses went wild, and one man claimed he unearthed a handful of paper that turned to dust before it reached sunlight. He said the writing on it was faint, yet one word remained legible: remember. And so the story spread again, of a woman whose divided gaze could see both the living and the buried, who refused to let the land rest until it remembered what it had done. By 1851, The tale of Dinah Clay had become something halfway between folklore and fear. The Broder lands remained unclaimed, and the county listed the property simply as abandoned and unfit for habitation. Yet travelers through the Missouri foothills still spoke of strange lights flickering along the ridge before storms, and of a woman's voice humming low songs that seemed to echo from the soil itself. That same year, a preacher from Lawrence County, Reverend Isaac Penley, came to investigate. Penley was no stranger to frontier superstition. He had spent years moving between small parishes to drive out what he called the sickness of memory that grows in land left unblessed. According to his journals, he arrived at the Broder property on a cold March morning accompanied by 2 deacons and a freedman named Caleb Holt, who served as his guide. The men found the house stripped to its bones, roof half fallen, floorboards warped, yet still bearing signs of occupation. The hearth was warm, Penley wrote, though there was no coal, no fire, and no smoke upon the air. The Reverend claimed they heard soft singing drifting from the well behind the house. Holt went first to look, leaning over the stones. He said the water was black, Penley noted, but within it glowed a light like a coin-catching sun. Then Holt screamed and staggered back. His right eye had gone white, sightless. "She looked up," he whispered, "and she's still looking." That night as they camped by the ridge, wind swept through the trees with a low hum like a bow drawn across a string. Penley recorded a vision not of terror but of stillness. "I saw her standing by the river, her face calm. Her eyes were open, one light, one dark. She said, 'I can see what's coming for both of you.' Then she turned and the air fell quiet." Within a month, Reverend Penley went blind. His final sermon, dictated to his deacons, survives in fragments. We speak of sin as something that ends with confession. But what if sin is a thing that remembers? What if it keeps its own witness until the day the land forgets how to lie? When he died later that year, his pupils were described as clouded, one black, one gray. The county buried him beside the small church he'd built, miles from the Broder place, yet on storm nights parishioners claimed the ground above his grave shivered. The deacons refused to ring the chapel bell again, saying they heard faint humming through the rope. And so, the story deepened, of a woman with divided eyes and a preacher who saw through hers, a warning that whatever walked the foothills had not finished seeing. By 1853, a decade after the first whispers of the bondwoman with mismatched eyes, the Missouri foothills had changed hands, yet the unease remained. New settlers built over the old ridge, convinced that superstition was the indulgence of poorer men. Still, no one stayed long. The fields near the Gasconade River grew wild again, and on quiet nights, people swore they heard low humming carried by the wind, the same song that had followed Dinah Clay from plantation to legend. A teacher named Martha Gentry arrived that spring to open a schoolhouse for the scattered families along the ridge. She was educated, skeptical, and proud of her reason. But in her letters to her sister in St. Louis, her confidence began to erode. In one, dated May 11th, 1853, she wrote, "The children will not cross the creek bridge. They say a woman stands there when it rains, her face turned toward the current. They call her Miss Dinah as if she were still alive." Weeks later, Martha mentioned meeting an elderly black woman selling herbs door to door. The woman's hair was white, her eyes shaded under a bonnet. When Martha remarked that she must have poor vision working in such dim light, the woman smiled and lifted her chin slightly. "I see what I need," she said. One eye was a pale silver gray, the other dark as river water. That same night the schoolhouse caught fire. No one was inside, but witnesses described seeing 2 shadows standing before the flames, one taller than the other. The next morning, the ground where the fire had burned was cool, untouched by ash. On the charred wall, only one word remained legible in chalk: remember. County officials recorded the incident as vandalism, but the locals began marking their doors with small handprints dipped in soot, saying it kept the watcher from mistaking their homes for graves. Around this time, Dr. Lemuel Crane of Jefferson County, a man familiar with the Dred Scott legal hearings then stirring in St. Louis, began compiling local testimonies for a study on frontier superstition. His notes mention a woman of unusual eyes seen along the Gasconade between 1849 and 1853, whom several witnesses described as both old and young in the same hour. Crane dismissed the accounts as shared delusion born of regional hysteria, until he himself saw something near the river one storming night. His final entry reads, "She stood where the lightning struck but did not move. I saw her eyes, gray and black, and the sky behind her bent as if it too were afraid to look directly." Crane's field notes end abruptly. His body was never recovered, though his medical bag washed up days later. The metal clasps melted into the shape of an open hand. After that, people began saying Dinah Clay had not died at all, that she had become something the foothills themselves carried, an unending breath between thunder and silence. The bondwoman who saw both worlds now belonged to neither. By 1855, the hills of Missouri were restless again. The air itself seemed to carry tension, a pulse beneath every storm. The Dred Scott case in St. Louis was stirring talk across the state, and even in the foothills, people felt the unease of history refusing to settle. In that year's county records appears a single curious line, written in the margin beside a weather report: "Thunder without clouds. Singing carried from the river." It was around then that the widow Abigail Jern, who ran a small mill on the edge of the old Broder tract, began keeping her own notes. She was a meticulous woman, skeptical of everything except her own eyes. In her journal, she wrote of finding strange impressions on her property after every rain, circles pressed into the earth, filled with clear water that reflected light long after dusk. "It's as though the ground remembers a storm that hasn't come yet," she wrote. One night that spring, she woke to the sound of footsteps on her porch. When she opened the door, she found a tall woman standing in the rain, head uncovered, shawl drenched through. One eye shone faintly gray even in darkness, the other swallowed what little light the lantern offered. The stranger spoke softly, "Your river's not done washing." Abigail tried to offer her shelter, but the woman smiled and said, "I walk between places." Then she stepped off the porch and was gone. At sunrise, the mill's water wheel had stopped. The current, usually calm, was filled with ash, soft, black, floating downstream like soot from an unseen fire. Later, the same ash appeared across the valley, coating fields, wells, and windowsills, though no one smelled smoke. It vanished by noon. When Abigail reported what she'd seen to the sheriff, he dismissed it as delirium. But 3 days later, he too recorded something strange. A faint hum carried through the air before each flash of lightning, as though the sky were waiting for someone to finish speaking. His words match other reports filed across the Ozarks that same year. By the winter of 1855, people no longer spoke her name aloud. They called her the one who walks in stormlight. And though no one claimed to see her face again, her presence was felt in the sound of water turning still, in the flicker of lamps before thunder, in the way the ground seemed to breathe after rain. Old farmers said she wasn't haunting anything. She was reminding it. And in those long, sleepless nights, when the horizon pulsed with silent lightning, even the most practical men left a lantern burning on their porch, one pale, one dim, just in case the woman with the divided gaze was still walking between worlds, counting what the land had yet to forget. By 1857, the legend of Dinah Clay had spread beyond the Missouri foothills, reaching the courts and drawing rooms of St. Louis, where polite society treated it as superstition of the backcountry. But to those who lived along the Gasconade River, she was no myth. She was a pattern, appearing in the years before disaster, her divided eyes watching like the sky itself. That spring, a flood swallowed half of Hickory Hollow, taking livestock and 2 small cabins. The survivors swore that, on the night before the waters rose, they saw a woman walking the shallows. She wasn't drowning, one farmer said. She was guiding the current. In the months after the flood, a small orphanage was established near the old Broder property by a minister's wife, Mrs. Ruth Ansell, who wrote regularly to church benefactors in Jefferson City. Her surviving letters are calm, practical, except for one dated September 3, 1857. The children play by the river each evening. Yesterday they came home wet to the knees, saying they'd been showing Miss Dinah their skipping stones. I scolded them for making up ghosts, but they all described her the same way, one bright eye, one dark, smiling though she said nothing. They insist she lives where the water talks. That week the orphanage well turned black for a full day, then cleared on its own. No illness followed. Mrs. Ansell took it as a sign of mercy. Others whispered it was payment. Later that year, during a thunderstorm that rolled without rain, a traveler sheltering near the property claimed he saw children standing in a semicircle by the riverbank, their faces lit from below. When lightning flashed, he realized they weren't alone. A woman stood behind them, her hand resting gently on the shoulder of each child. She was teaching them to listen, he said, like thunder was her language. The next morning, the children were safe, the building untouched, but every iron hinge on its doors had rusted overnight, and the schoolroom chalkboard bore faint writing across its surface. "I will keep what they forget." Scholars later dismissed this as the hysteria of a frightened widow. Yet one detail refused explanation. Every child who had claimed to see her grew to adulthood with one eye a shade lighter than the other, as though marked by reflection. By the late 1850s, as Missouri edged toward war and the Dred Scott verdict fanned the fire of conscience across the state, locals began to say that Dinah Clay no longer haunted the land. She guarded it. When lightning struck without thunder, they whispered she was walking between storms, her mismatched eyes keeping the balance between vengeance and remembrance. And sometimes, when the river swelled too high, mothers told their frightened children, "Don't be afraid. She's only counting." By 1860, war was stirring in the distance, but for the foothills of Missouri, the greater unease lay closer to home. The orphanage near the river had been abandoned after a lightning strike burned its roof clean through, though the surrounding trees remained untouched. The people whispered that Dinah Clay, the bondwoman with the mismatched eyes, had finally claimed what was hers: the children's voices, the hum before the rain, the memory of what the land refused to release. That autumn, a school inspector named Edgar Knoll, newly assigned to the region, was tasked with cataloging all unoccupied properties before the coming conflict. Among the papers retrieved from the ruins of the orphanage was a ledger written in two hands, one steady, one slanted, as though the writer had been unsure which way the lines ran. The early entries listed supplies, donations, attendance. The later pages grew stranger. Names of children long deceased, notes in the margins that read "not forgotten," "still walking," and finally, a phrase that Knoll underlined in his report: "Her site is the river's memory." What disturbed him more were the final entries, written after the orphanage had burned, the ink fresh, the pages dry. He copied one into his notes. "I count what cannot die, one eye for the living, one for the gone." Knoll showed the ledger to the county judge, who dismissed it as vandalism, but the inspector left the region that winter and never returned. His replacement, Mr. Walter Corbin, found the same ledger months later in a completely different building, the old Broder House, miles away. The ink had changed again, darker now, and the names inside were new. That same year, thunder began to roll through the foothills without clouds. The farmers said it was her voice traveling under the earth, moving with the rivers, remembering every house that tried to forget her name. Some claimed to see her at a distance, still barefoot, still calm, her mismatched eyes reflecting both dawn and dusk. A local preacher, Reverend Cole, tried to quiet the panic with a sermon titled "The Divided Sight of Sin." But that night his own church bell rang once soft, low, like a single heartbeat. The rope was found still, yet his wife swore the sound came from under the floorboards. By the time the first soldiers passed through the valley in 1861, the locals had already sealed their wells and moved their livestock to higher ground. Not from fear of battle, but of rain. They said when the sky turned gray, Dinah's gaze opened again, one eye to the storm above, the other to the storm still buried below. And somewhere between thunder and silence, her ledger kept writing. By 1862, the war had reached the Missouri Foothills, but soldiers spoke of more than battles. They spoke of the woman with the storm-colored eyes. Union patrols crossing the Gasconade River claimed to hear her humming just before the fog rolled in. Confederate scouts on the opposite bank told the same story. Both sides called her a sign, one of doom, the other of deliverance. A soldier's journal found years later in Jefferson City contained this entry. Rained without clouds today. The water on my rifle barrel stayed warm to the touch. Saw her by the tree line. She looked at me like she was remembering something I hadn't done yet. The man's name was Private Harlan Yo, a farmhand from the Broder Ridge. He was killed the next day when lightning struck a tree beside him, the only bolt recorded that month. Witnesses swore the sky had been clear. During that same campaign, Colonel James Rainier reported entire regiments losing their way in daylight. "The compass needles spin," he wrote, "and the earth hums like it carries its own heartbeat." Some soldiers deserted, wandering into the forest muttering of a woman singing beneath the rain. Even the clergy grew cautious. Reverend Cole's successor at the Hilltop Church, Father Anselm Ward, attempted a blessing ceremony near the old Broder ruins. Halfway through, the clouds lowered so suddenly that daylight vanished. His deacons later testified that he froze mid-prayer, staring at the riverbank, his lips moving soundlessly. One claimed he heard the words, "She remembers you." When Ward returned home that night, he was pale and shaking. He burned his cassock and refused to hold Mass again. His final entry in the parish ledger reads, "I felt her watching through both worlds. The light of one eye for the living, the dark for those already gone. I think she chooses who hears her." The war tore through the region for years, leaving scars that would never close. But the foothills, unlike the rest of Missouri, were spared heavy fighting. Both armies avoided them. Soldiers sent to scout the area simply vanished. Locals said the land itself hid them, folding them into the same silence where Dinah Clay still walked. After the war ended, veterans spoke of her with a kind of reverence. To them, she wasn't a ghost but a witness, the one being who had watched every field of blood and wept not out of grief, but recognition. The freed people who settled near the river called her Aunt Dinah of the Eyes, leaving food and candles by the water before storms. And when lightning flashed over the foothills without thunder, they would bow their heads and whisper, "She's still watching who remembers and who doesn't." By 1865, the war was over, but the hills of Missouri had not found peace. The ridge above the Gasconade was overgrown now, its old road washed out, the river swollen and erratic. Veterans came home to find fences twisted by floods, houses half sunk in mud, and a silence that did not feel natural. The air, they said, had weight. One family, the Garans, rebuilt the Broder homestead that spring. They were newly freed people from Tennessee, hopeful and hardworking, unaware of the legend that had taken root beneath their new house. In their first letter back east, Mrs. Garan wrote of soft music in the floorboards, like strings being tuned, and how her children woke in the night claiming to hear a woman praying below the earth. At first they dismissed it as imagination, until the day the well began to hum. The sound rose at dusk and faded at dawn, deep and rhythmic. The eldest son, Matthew, went down with a lantern to investigate. He returned pale, claiming to have seen a shimmer of eyes reflected in the water, one bright, one dark. The family sealed the well that evening. It vibrated through the boards all night. In town, the new preacher, Reverend Clive Horton, warned his congregation that the devil takes familiar shapes, referencing the story of the mismatched woman. But the Garans were steadfast. "She ain't a devil," Mrs. Garan said. "If she wanted us gone, she wouldn't have sung." When the rains came, the humming grew louder, until one night it turned into words. "She's still counting," whispered the youngest girl, half asleep. "She says the river's too full of names." By morning the house was gone, swept away, every beam carried into the current. Only the foundation remained, smooth as polished stone. The preacher declared it punishment, yet in the debris they found something the water hadn't touched, a leather book bound in iron clasps. Inside it was dry, the ink unbleed. The handwriting was unmistakably the same divided script found in the old Broder ledger. Its final entry read, "The land remembers me, the house remembers you, the river remembers all." The preacher ordered it burned, but the flames turned blue and died before touching the pages. It was buried under the church instead, though the sexton later said he could hear it humming when storms passed. And when the church itself burned 2 winters later, no cause ever found, the earth beneath its foundation remained blackened but unbroken, still warm long after the ashes cooled. Locals began to say Dinah Clay was not haunting anymore. She had become the echo that stitched every forgotten voice together. She was the house that sang to itself, the hum beneath the ground, the memory that neither war nor time could erase. By 1868, the war was a ghost, but the land in the Missouri foothills was still restless. The Gasconade ran low that summer, its water tinted with the strange metallic hue that old settlers now recognized as a sign, a warning that the earth was listening again. Travelers whispered that Dinah Clay's hum had returned, faint but constant, rising from beneath the riverbed like the drone of some buried choir. A surveyor named Lucian Webb came to chart new rail lines through the valley. He was a man of science, skeptical of local tales. But his field book, later recovered by his apprentice, tells another story. The river bends oddly near the Broder tract. Standing there at noon, I saw my reflection split half light, half shadow. Then another face appeared beside mine, eyes mismatched, smiling faintly. When I stepped back, the water was calm again. He returned to camp shaken, insisting the reflection had spoken. His assistant found him that night staring into a basin of still water, whispering, "She's drawing the map from below." In the morning, Webb was gone, his boots still standing by the fire. His compass lay open beside them, the needle unmoving. That same year, a nearby farmer claimed the river had begun to change course again, eating its own banks and uncovering the bones of old fences and stone markers. Beneath one uprooted willow, he found fragments of brick and scorched wood, the remains of what locals believed was the original Broder home. Buried in the ash was a small shard of mirror, the glass darkened with age. When turned toward the sun, it reflected no light. The object passed through several hands before vanishing from the county record. But before it did, a single note was logged beside it in the registrar's book. Property of D. Clay estate claimed by no one, returned by all. That winter, Reverend Horton, now old and half-mad, claimed to hear singing near the banks. When the deacons followed, they found no one, only ripples that glowed faintly beneath the ice. The minister insisted it was her mirror, reflecting upward from where she watched. "Every time we forget her name," he said, "the river reminds itself." From that year on, people avoided washing clothes or drawing water after sunset. They said if you looked too long into the reflection, you might see your own face change, one eye paling, the other darkening, as if the river were borrowing your sight for a moment. By 1870, children along the foothills sang a rhyme the adults pretended not to hear. "One eye for the moon, one for the clay. The river hums where the lost ones stay." The elders called it blasphemy, but the children swore they didn't learn it from anyone living. By 1872, the people of the Missouri foothills had grown wary of the Gasconade River. It no longer froze in winter, nor ran clear in spring. Even the air along its banks carried a quiet vibration, like the steady breath of something sleeping just below. Those who still lived near the ridge told newcomers to never draw water after dusk. "You'll pull up what ain't meant for you," they said. That same year, Dr. Ephraim Barlow, a physician from St. Louis, arrived to document what he called regional cases of ocular oddity and hysteria. He had heard of the mismatched woman from an aging minister who described her as the last unburied conscience of the frontier. Barlow came armed with skepticism and a field camera, new technology then, heavy as stone and loud as judgment. He set up camp near the remains of the Broder homestead, taking photographs of the river at different hours to study the play of light. But the plates that returned from his first session disturbed him. Each image showed the same figure standing at the river's bend, face turned toward the water, though no one had been there. The exposure showed detail, hands folded, shawl drawn tight, and in one frame 2 faint gleams, one white, one black. The eyes took the light, he wrote. They bent it backward. Barlow persisted for several days, cataloging temperature changes, magnetic fluctuations, and testimonies from nearby families. One evening, while reviewing his notes, he heard humming near the well, the same low tune described in old Broder ledgers. He approached with his lantern raised and found his reflection staring back at him from the water, but the reflection blinked first. His diary, later retrieved from his trunk, ends with a final paragraph. I believe she is not apparition but echo, made of light divided, one for the world above, one for the world it hides. If I look too long, I'll forget which is mine. He disappeared the following morning. The tent was undisturbed, the river calm. Only his camera remained, its last plate shattered. When developed weeks later, the cracks formed the shape of a face, smiling faintly, one eye clear, one dark. In the years that followed, others claimed to hear his voice mingled with the hum beneath the ground, calling out medical observations in calm, measured tones between the storms. Scholars dismissed this as local folklore, but farmers swore the ridge had learned his words, repeating them whenever lightning flashed without rain. By 1874, the legend of Dinah Clay was no longer told in fear, but in awe. They said she had gathered the memories of the land, the overseers, the preachers, even the doctors, and carried them where history refused to tread. She was not haunting the foothills anymore. She was teaching them how to see. By 1876, the Missouri Foothills had learned to live with their silence. The farms that remained kept to daylight. No one fetched water after sunset. The river, once broad and steady, had divided into twin channels, one running clear, the other dark as ink. Locals called them the 2 eyes of Dinah Clay. That same year, a traveling painter named August Mears came to the region to capture what he called the haunted calm of the frontier. He rented a small cabin near the river and began a series of sketches of the landscape. In his surviving letters, Mears wrote of the strange quality of light that seemed to shimmer unevenly across the valley, as if 2 suns were fighting for the same sky. But the painting that would make him vanish was titled The Divided Water. Neighbors who saw the unfinished canvas described a tall woman standing at the river's edge, her eyes mismatched, one bright and reflective, the other a dark pool that seemed to absorb all color. When Mears showed it to the innkeeper's wife, she wept without knowing why. It felt like being looked at by something older than sorrow, she said. That night, Mears worked by lamplight until a storm rolled over the ridge. Lightning struck nearby, though no thunder followed. The next morning his cabin stood empty, his easel overturned, and the paint on the canvas had run into perfect symmetry, one side pale blue, the other jet black, blending in the center like meeting eyes. The river outside had changed course again. In the following months, families downriver complained of a hum beneath the soil that rose and fell with the current. Horses refused to drink, and iron tools left on the ground grew warm to the touch. A county surveyor who investigated wrote in his report, "It is as if the water carries a pulse of its own, 2 beats, not one." That phrase became legend, the twin heartbeat of the river. The people said it was Dinah, walking both banks at once, one eye on the living, one on the lost. They hung twin lanterns on their porches before storms, one filled with oil, one empty, to show her they still remembered which world was theirs. Scholars who later studied the event dismissed it as folklore born from geological shifts and grief carried forward from war. Yet none could explain the water's strange glow during certain nights of the year, when the 2 channels mirrored each other perfectly under the moonlight, forming what locals called the reflection without reflection. And those who dared to stand at the water's edge in that pale hour swore they saw her walking the current, face serene, eyes open, holding her hands as though weighing light and shadow between her palms. By 1878, the legend of Dinah Clay had ripened into something the people of Missouri no longer argued about. They didn't need proof. They simply lived around her. The river split and rejoined with the seasons, its twin channels humming softly beneath the surface, as though echoing the sound of a voice no one could fully remember. That year, a construction crew arrived to extend a railway spur toward Rolla, cutting directly across the valley once owned by the Broder family. The men camped along the riverbank, confident that tales of the bondwoman's eyes were country nonsense. Within days, their equipment began failing. Iron warped without heat, nails refused to hold, and in the silence before dawn the ground itself began to sing. A low, even tone that rose from the soil, vibrating their tents. The foreman, Joseph Hale, described it later in a deposition. It wasn't noise, it was a note, like the whole hill was breathing, and it was in tune with the lightning. They pressed on anyway. When the first rail was laid across the ridge, the sky broke open with a sudden storm. Rain fell in perfect rhythm to the metallic hum, and the men swore they saw two figures in the distance, one dark, one light, walking side by side along the river, each holding a lantern whose glow merged like the meeting of water and sky. By morning, the entire section of track had buckled as if twisted by unseen hands. Locals took it as a warning. The land itself had chosen to remain unbroken. The railroad abandoned the route, leaving the valley untouched. In its silence, a new kind of reverence took hold. Travelers who passed through on horseback said they could hear faint singing beneath their hooves, and that the trees swayed even when the air was still. That autumn, the Reverend Silas Bray, a scholar of frontier faiths, visited to investigate. He wrote to a colleague at the seminary, "The hum is constant. It stops when you speak her name aloud, as though the earth pauses to listen. I do not know whether she is angel or memory, but I feel certain that the land has taken her side." His report was never published. Bray went blind within the year. Those who tended to him said one of his eyes clouded white, the other black as ink. After that, even the skeptics fell quiet. Farmers began leaving 2 bowls of water by their doorsteps before storms, one filled from the clear channel, one from the dark. "So she can see through both sides," they said. The act wasn't worship, only respect. And whenever the ground trembled just before thunder, the people of the foothills would murmur to one another, "She's singing again." The earth still remembers her voice. By 1880, the Missouri foothills had grown quiet again, or so it seemed. The war and its echoes had faded, and the towns along the Gasconade were rebuilding in peace. Yet one corner of the valley, the ridge above Benton Creek, remained empty ground, a place where no one built, no matter how fertile the soil. They said it belonged to her still. And when storms came without thunder, the locals left their doors unlatched, muttering, "Let her pass." That spring, a new church rose in Rolla, its twin bells cast from melted cannon metal, the congregation proud that the weapons of war had been turned to faith. But the bells rang wrong from the first. The left bell sang bright and clear. The right gave a low tone that trembled like distant thunder. The parishioners called them the eyes of the church, one light, one dark. The pastor, Reverend Abel Pike, dismissed the superstition, until one night he stayed late to catalog tithes. At midnight, both bells began to move, though no rope had been touched. Their tones merged into a slow, unearthly harmony, low enough to shake the floor. Pike fled the tower, but when he looked back, he saw a figure standing between the bells, her hands resting gently on the metal. Lightning lit her face for an instant, one eye bright as polished silver, the other absorbing all light like an eclipse. The bells ceased. In the morning, Pike's hair had turned completely white. He left town within the week, telling no one where he was bound. Afterward, the church refused to use the bells again. They said the tones never matched. When one sounded, the other stayed silent. But on certain nights, the two would ring together without human hand, their notes carrying across the foothills like a call to something buried deep beneath. and each time they did, a faint hum rose from the ground in answer, trembling the windows and stirring the river miles away. The townsfolk began to understand. The bells weren't haunted, they were in tune with the land. One sang for the living, the other for what remembered. The people stopped calling them cursed and began lighting candles under their tower steps instead, saying it was courtesy to the divided woman, who had taught even iron how to sing. In later years, travelers described hearing those twin tones rolling through fog before storms, a harmony so low it felt like breath against the spine. When asked what it meant, the elders of Rolla said quietly, "That's her voice coming home. One bell for the day, one for the dark. She's walking between them again." By 1883, the ridge above the Gasconade River was quiet once more, a wilderness of vine and mist. The bells in Rolla had fallen silent, and the church that housed them was half collapsed, its roof caved in by weather or time. The locals said the earth had finally tired of being listened to. Yet every few years, someone new wandered into the valley and returned changed, eyes wide, voice hushed, speaking of a light that moved where no wind blew. That autumn, a young woman named Clara Hensley, daughter of one of the railway foremen, went walking near the abandoned tracks. She was known for her stubborn courage, the kind that refused to bow to ghost tales. At dusk, she found herself at the old crossing where the twin channels met again. The air there was perfectly still, and in the water she saw her reflection, divided, one side bright in sunset, the other shadowed in gathering night. Then another face appeared beside hers, its eyes of two colors gleaming faintly like lanterns under the surface. Clara did not run. "What do you want?" she whispered. The voice that answered was soft, almost kind. "Only to remember, you forget too easily." The water stilled. When she looked again, her reflection was whole, her eyes unchanged. But when she returned home, she could not bear to speak above a whisper. For the rest of her life, whenever thunder rolled without lightning, she lit 2 candles and left her door open. By the end of that decade, the story of Dinah Clay, the bondwoman of divided sight, had faded into the archives, half fact, half rumor, wholly unburied. The hills around Benton Creek grew wild, the foundations of old houses swallowed by roots. Only the church bells remained, rusted into silence, their tones still joined in memory. Old people said that if you stood on the ridge at midnight, the ground beneath your feet still hummed, 2 notes rising and falling like the breath of something vast. Some said it was the echo of her song, others said it was the earth keeping count, just as she had done. And though no one alive could remember her face, every child born near the foothills still carried a saying, passed down in lullaby. "One eye for truth, one for grace. Keep them closed till storms embrace." To this day, when thunder trembles low across the Gasconade, and the air grows warm without rain, the locals say the same thing their grandparents once whispered. She walks the ridge again, calm and eternal, lantern in hand. The woman with the divided eyes, keeping watch over both the living and the forgotten.